Hello, comrades. Welcome to the Revolution Report. Thanks a lot for joining us on this live stream. It's going to be about war today because obviously there's a lot of people on the left that, first of all, hold on a second. I think I'm having some sound issues. If there's an echo or anything, let me know in the chat and I'll make sure to fix it. But yeah, as Jenny said, you can't march into battle with this music and lose. It's impossible, exactly. But anyway, comrades, yeah, so going back to the point that I wanted to start with, I named this live stream a sort of variation on the Roman quote, the Roman proverb, let him who desires peace prepare for war. That, in terms of the way Marxists view war and conflict, could not be closer to the truth. You know, there's a lot of different colors of the rainbow on the left, many of whom are pacifists who understand this concept of being anti-war as something idealistic or simplistic, mechanical, you know. Being anti-war means you'll never support a war at all. But as Marxists, we have a different approach, of course. We look at the situation dialectically. We look at the situation in terms of how it interacts, how different forces involved in the conflict are interacting with each other. What consequences does it have for the working class in a given country internationally? What consequences does a certain war have for the ruling classes that are involved? So, I mean, I guess we can really start this discussion or this explanation with a very simple anecdote. You know, I try not to get anecdotal with this stuff, but I think there's one that's very fitting, right? I grew up in an American school system. You know, I was born in New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. I remember something that happened to me when I was in school. I mean, I never really got into any fights when I was in like kindergarten or whatever. But I remember the teachers would constantly tell the kids, you know, if another kid hits you, then you shouldn't hit them back. You should just tell the teacher, right? And obviously, my initial reaction as a kid was that I thought that was unfair. But I was like, you know, the teacher is the teacher. Then I went back to my parents and I told them that the teachers had this stance on you know, being attacked. And I remember my mom was like, I don't care what the teacher says. If someone hits you, you hit them back, and I'll take care of the teacher no matter what the consequences, you know? And I feel like most parents, the vast majority of logical parents, would want their kids to defend themselves in school, right? Unless there's some weird hippie liberal, you know, that has this strange stance where they wouldn't want their kid to defend themselves. Because when they get into the real world, I mean, let's be real. There's not going to be a teacher to go crying to when someone hits you or someone does something, you know, it's just someone wrongs you in some way. You have to learn how to stick up for yourself, you know. I mean, and this to be honest is the same with war. There's no crying to the United Nations if you're being attacked, if genocide's being committed against you, because the UN will maybe say something, maybe not, depending whether or not you're a friend of Russia or not. But regardless, no one's going to come to help you, right? And that much is clear in terms of the Gaza situation, which we're going to get into later. But my point is that war, as a Marxist, I'm obviously against war in general, right? One of the goals of communist society is the complete eradication of war. But we understand war as a general concept, as something that is the result of class contradictions, right? According to the according to the Engelsist idea of history, right? Before there were class contradictions, tribes in primitive communist society generally lived in, you know, more or less peace with one another. Of course, there were disagreements and there were some wars, but there were not, and there were conflicts, but there were not wars on the scale that we saw at the dawn of slave society, that we've seen in feudalism, that we've seen in capitalism. So wars, as we understand them, as we've understood them from the dawn of class society, Marxists understand it in terms of the big scheme of things as a result of class contradictions in class society. But that doesn't mean that looking at the concrete conditions of a certain war that you should be against it all the time. There's many different types of wars. Of course, we know, we can give several examples of wars that Marxists have participated in, even Trotskyists really participated in the defense of the Spanish Republic against Francisco Franco's forces, for example, in the 1930s. China's wars against the Japanese, against the Kuomintang were completely justified. They were liberation wars, right? Mao wrote much on guerrilla tactics. Fidel Castro and Che Guevara wrote much, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara fought a guerrilla war against the Batista regime, and Che Guevara went on to fight more guerrilla wars, writing pieces of his own on guerrilla warfare, right? So you could be a progressive and be on the left and not be a leftist, I guess, in the way we understand it now, in terms of your approach to war, right? There are different types of them, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's important to understand that war is not a monolithic thing. It's a horrible thing that nobody, should have to ever experience. It's horrible. I've seen it for myself as a war correspondent. It's probably one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life personally. The effects of war. It's very horrible. So we as Marxists don't want war, but we understand the justifications for wars in certain circumstances, and we understand the application of violence and conflicts in war as justified under certain conditions. Obviously, we don't support adventurism, like randomly hurting people or randomly breaking shop windows or anything like that, or rioting randomly or killing people. We don't advocate for that. This is random violence that all major communists throughout history have objected to. But to give you a better understanding of the classical Marxist line, I've got a quote here from Lenin on war that I thought was very good. So I'm just going to read it out and then continue on with this. Also, before I go on, I'm reading some of the stuff that you're putting in the chat. I was also a little worried that this live stream might get censored for the kind of stuff that we're going to be talking about, because, as I understand, Ham Sandwiches is not a terrorist organization in Russia, but it is in America. So, if we're going to be talking about defending ham sandwiches, then that could be problematic. But whatever, fuck it. I'm in the process of looking into how to stream on different platforms where we could talk about more stuff that YouTube would probably end up banning. But anyway, Lenin's quote on war. So this, by the way, is during World War I, where he said this quote. There is an inter-imperialist war. He's referring to, of course, World War I. With that war, we have nothing to do. But there are also wars of national uprising by oppressed nationalities. The Irish uprising is 100% justified. Even if German imperialism tries to profit from it, even if leaders of the national movement link up with German submarines, this does not change the just nature of the Irish War of Independence against British imperialism. The same thing is true for the national movement in the colonies and the semi-colonies, the Indian movement, the Turkish movement, the Persian movement. The same thing is true for the oppressed nationalities in Russia and Austro-Hungary. The Polish national movement, remember, this is back when the Austro-Hungarian Empire was still around. The Polish national movement is a just movement. The Czech national movement is a just movement. The movement by any oppressed nationality against the imperialist oppressor is a just movement. And the fact that the leadership of these movements could betray by linking these movements politically and organizationally to imperialism is a reason to denounce these leaders not a reason to condemn these movements. So I think it's important to specifically understand that Lenin is taking the complete opposite of an ultra-leftist line here. I want to reiterate that he says, even if German imperialism tries to profit from the Irish national liberation movement against British imperialism, it doesn't nullify the fact that this is a liberation movement, that this is a movement of national liberation and therefore a struggle that's justified, right? Because this is something that specifically with the Russian military operation, right? A lot of socialists, Trotskyists, ultra-leftists that have said that the Russian military operation is an epic from an inter-imperialist war between America and Russia don't know what they're talking about. The main thrust of their argument is usually to say that there are some, there are not only Western capitalists that are making money off of this struggle, but also some oligarchs in Russia. I haven't given a lot of attention to these arguments, like in terms of which oligarchs exactly are benefiting from the Russian military operation in Ukraine, because it's kind of irrelevant, right? It doesn't nullify the fact that the Russian military operation is a response to Western imperialism. The first instance of Western imperialist aggression in Ukraine started with the 2014 Euromaidan fascist-backed coup d'etat. That was when the United States and its proxies moved into Russia's backyard very aggressively, and they started their own war of aggression against the people of Donbass. And the Russian military operation is a war of liberation of that region that was under constant bombardment and attacks by the Ukrainian military. Another example, right? We can take from this book that I really like to take examples from. It's called Logic. I have it in Russian, but you can find it somehow on the internet in English, I'm pretty sure. But it's written by this guy Strogovich, who was like one of the founders of Soviet legal theory. He was a brilliant logician, and he wrote this book that's basically like a short course on Soviet logic, Soviet formal logic with touches of dialectical logic there as well. And one of the things that he writes in the book, I've got on, I translated it over here in English because it's all in Russian, but on page 162 it says, "A just war is a war that is not one of aggression, but a liberation war with the goal of defending the nation from foreign invasion and attempts to enslave it, or the liberation of a people from capitalist slavery and dependence on imperialist powers." So we've got different types of wars here, I came up with a couple, myself, I came up with several different obvious ones. I'm sure looking at all different wars throughout history, you could come up with a long list of different types of wars depending on specific circumstances. But essentially, I think looking at World War II basically covers a lot of them, basically covers the main ones, right? The Allied powers, despite most of them being imperialist capitalist powers, fought a war of liberation from fascism, against fascism. Because fascism itself had launched an imperialist war. And that doesn't mean that World War II is an inter-imperialist war, because these are two different things. Launching an imperialist war and having an inter-imperialist war, right? Because although the Nazis had begun to wage an imperialist war across Europe because they were trying to take territory, resources, take control of, just expand basically Lebensraum, that doesn't mean that the defenders, who were necessarily in themselves imperialist powers, that doesn't mean that they were fighting an imperialist war against Nazi Germany as well, because after all, they didn't, conquer these areas in the same way. They were liberating them from fascism. But it's also important to understand that Nazi Germany, while it launched an imperialist war against much of the world, the war it launched against the Soviet Union was a bit different. And even in Russia, there's World War II is kind of understood as two different types of wars. There's World War II, which is World War II, and then there's what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, which is specifically the Soviet experience in World War II. Because we can't forget that the Soviet Union lost the most. The Soviet Union suffered the most casualties out of any other combatant in World War II by far. They lost over 27 million people, civilians, soldiers, all to defend their motherland against fascism. And that's because the war that Nazi Germany launched against the Soviet Union was not an imperialist war. It was a war of annihilation. The Nazis had the goal of annihilating the Slavs. They were waging total war against the Soviet Union. And they were destroying everything in their path that wasn't beneficial to the German Reich, or wasn't part of these foolish collaborators that would have been annihilated anyway in the long run if the Nazis had won World War II. So the Soviet Union was not only fighting on the other side of the coin. The Soviet Union was not only fighting a war of liberation, but it was fighting a war for its very existence. And that is basically another type of war. I would say there's imperialist wars and wars of liberation, and at the extreme ends of those concepts, there's wars of annihilation and wars for existence. We've seen that before in history. It's kind of like the extremes of these two concepts in war, right? So that's why there's the Second World War for Russians and the Great Patriotic War. The Great Patriotic War was the Soviet Union's war for existence. And World War II was a war of liberation in a broader sense, really. Although, of course, in the Great Patriotic War, they were also liberating their territories, but they were liberating them alongside defending the very existence of their state, of their people, of their culture, etc. And this is why communists who have the correct line on the Russian military operation understand it as a war of liberation. Even though that Russia is not a socialist power, Russia is essentially a state capitalist. I mean, in terms of its political system, I would describe it as a Bonapartist regime, which I've written articles about that and spoken about it in previous live streams if you want to check out my thoughts on that. But so Russia, despite being a capitalist power, it's not an imperialist one. It's in the same multipolar camp as China, as Cuba, as North Korea, as Venezuela, as Laos. The entire socialist world is in the same camp as Russia. And obviously the communist world is fighting imperialism, struggling tooth and nail against imperialism, most from everything from sanctions against the entire economy to struggling for their very existence. And Russia's in their camp, so it's not a capitalist country that's imperialist. And if you look at every socialist country that exists on the planet, there's not one that does not support Russia in the military operation, or at least, I mean, they either support it wholeheartedly, or they say we understand that NATO was the organization that provoked this conflict. But there's no socialist nation in the world that says Russia's launched an imperialist war in Ukraine. It's just ridiculous from a Marxist perspective. And thank you, well-intentioned asphalt. Bonapartism is an important phenomenon for revolutionaries to understand. I agree 100%. I appreciate the donation. Bonapartism is a very important concept for revolutionaries to understand. If you don't understand it, read the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. This is where Karl Marx expands on his ideas on Bonapartism and the theory in general. But it's very important to understand because that's the line of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation on the current Russian government. And, it's essentially a political situation where, usually in society, there's a class that runs society, right? In the United States, you got the capitalist class, they run society, the working class, they're the repressed class. The state is under the control of the capitalist class through the control of the two major political parties, the fact that candidates are basically elected through the party before the primaries even take place, and they have to prove to the party's biggest donors, which are the biggest capitalists in the country, that they can represent their interests. That's how the capitalist class controls politics in the West. In Russia, that's turned on its head. The state actually controls the capitalist class. The capitalist class cannot do whatever it wants. There have been capitalists that have tried to do that in Russia, and they've been basically liquidated by the state one way or another. And that's because there's a national program that the state has, and the capitalists have to get with it. And so the actual politics of the country is not dominated by the profit motive. It's dominated by the state bureaucracy that's left over from the Soviet Union. And this is often this is a political phenomenon that takes place after revolutionary change in society. So we saw that this is from actually after the chaos that ensues from revolutionary change. So we've seen a textbook example of Bonapartism with the fall of the Soviet Union, the wild 90s, and then Vladimir Putin coming to power. This is similar to what we saw with what Karl Marx talks about in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte with Louis Napoleon or Napoleon III. So definitely read that book if you want to read more about Bonapartism, if you want to understand this concept that the political structure of Russia more as well. But anyway, going back to war and what I wanted to talk about with that. This is why Russia's not an imperialist power. It's not finance capital that dictates to the state what actions it's going to take, what wars it's going to launch. Those decisions are determined by the state itself in Russia, and capitalists have to either get with the program or get out. But in terms of going back to this Lenin quote that we just looked at, Lenin brings up, of course, the example of the Irish liberation movement, right? But a more contemporary example would be the one that's been on everyone's minds ever since October 7th. Of course, that's the example of Gaza and the Palestinian people and ham sandwiches. I hope by calling them ham sandwiches that will stop YouTube from censoring us. But it's a clear situation of justified violence, right? October 7th, what happened in October 7th, whatever you think about what happened, it was not the beginning of this violence. The beginning of this violence started with a settler colonial invasion of Palestine. And the biggest argument that Israelis make, they don't deny that Israel was basically settled by European colonizers. They say that there's no evidence of a Palestinian state before the Balfour Declaration, that the British just set up this nation randomly, right? Even if that were true, there were people that now consider themselves Palestinians living on that territory, and they were either killed by Jewish militias, or they were displaced, or they continue to be displaced to this day. It was clearly a settler colonial occupation that has no justification, and that started back in the 1920s, right? And so, of course, after decades of living in an open-air prison, right? And we're not talking about just Gaza here. This of course, the struggle right now is focused around Gaza, but West Bank has a wall around it that's like 3 times the size of the Berlin Wall, that for some reason nobody ever looks to criticize, because it's Israel, and it's not a communist country that falls under the on the enemies of the United States list, right? It's a much more controlled, it's a much more militarized, it's a much more fortified wall than the Berlin Wall could have ever hoped to be. And this is going on in the West Bank, and in Gaza we're seeing a literal genocide happen. A genocide is taking place in Gaza. I mean, that much. I'm not afraid to say that. I don't care if it's not official, like in terms of in terms of what the international community has recognized. It's a literal genocide that's been going on there. The Israelis are not letting humanitarian aid get into the country. The United States is backing them and threatening to sanction the International Criminal Court just for suggesting that Benjamin Netanyahu should be arrested for committing war crimes. On top of that, any sort of criticism that is made towards Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu's like, that's anti-Semitism, that's anti-Semitism, that's anti-Semitism. He could call literally anything anti-Semitism. And the fact that some people just don't understand the difference between denying that Israel has a right to exist and denying that Jewish people have a right to exist is beyond me. I mean, I think that people who say that there's no difference between those two things are just really lying, because they don't have any sort of better justification for what's going on in Gaza right now. They just don't like Arabs or something, because it's a very simple logical difference between those two suppositions, right? And I haven't said this publicly on a live stream before, but this is really just such a another example, again, of what Marx said in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. He said that history repeats itself twice. First is tragedy, second is farce, right? By the way, I just want to thank Abtin Kamoshi for the super thanks. I wanted to thank you, Donald, for reintroducing me to Marxist-Leninist theory all those years ago. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to reintroduce you to that as well. Thanks for being on the live stream, comrade. So he said that history repeats itself twice. First, as tragedy, and second, as farce. Right? History doesn't repeat itself twice. History takes place twice. And this if you understand the history of Zionism and the history of Nazism as well, you understand that they have so much in common. So much. So much so that even when Israel was in the process of being founded and throughout the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power, the Zionists even came to an agreement with the Nazis to deport German Jews to Israel, because the Zionists and the Nazis had the same understanding of the Jewish nation, that Jews should all be in one place and out of the countries from of their national origin. Right? That's a crossover of what the Zionists and the Nazis believe, and they even had an official agreement to deport German Jews to Israel, because the Germans wanted to get rid of the Jews, and the Jews wanted the Zionists wanted the Jews to be gotten rid of from Europe as well. I mean, this is like a crossover of these two ideologies. And if we look at the crossover of Nazi ideology and Zionist ideology being ethnically centered imperialist right-wing ideologies, I mean, they're very similar, and now and the outcome of such an abhorrent ideology as Zionism, it's become just as bad as Nazism. The outcome is the same: complete disregard for a nation that they want to get rid of from what they consider to be their territory. Complete disregard for them. And the fact that they try to justify it with what happened on October 7th, that they try to justify just massive bombardments and attempting to annihilate entire neighborhoods in Gaza is just ridiculous. But this is why, from a Marxist perspective, ham sandwiches and the entire Palestinian resistance is completely justified. I mean, and you cannot, and you know, whatever ideology they have, whatever support they get for this national liberation struggle from wherever it comes, it doesn't change the material situation on the ground, that it's completely justified. I mean, any nation that's fighting for liberation, fighting a war for its existence. That's what the Palestinian resistance is doing. They're fighting for their very existence, and in the same way that the Soviet Union was fighting for its existence against Nazi Germany. Obviously on a smaller scale, because the Soviet Union has many more people. It faced a much larger scale attack, war of annihilation against them, but it's exactly the same the same concept they're fighting. They're fighting a war for their very existence. And you know what's really interesting, and to learn more about this, you should watch the videos that Cradle Media puts up. It's a really good media outlet. No matter how much military technology the Israelis have, no matter how much propaganda they put out, no matter how much political power they have around the world to prevent any sort of foreign intervention into what's going on, they cannot crush ham sandwiches, and they cannot crush the Palestinian resistance. It doesn't matter how much they bomb the shit out of these Palestinian neighborhoods. It doesn't matter how many soldiers they send in there, how many tanks, how many airstrikes they launch. It's not working. It's not working. The IDF is already having to pull out of places that it already occupied, because ham sandwiches is popping up on in different parts of Gaza that the Israelis previously considered that they had secured, and they're completely annihilating the IDF soldiers there. And it's hilarious how the Israeli propaganda, you know, Israeli soldiers are never killed in the Israeli propaganda. They're either injured, they're either attacked by wasps. I don't know if you guys heard about that. They either commit suicide. There's almost never any sort of admission that Israeli soldiers are killed by ham sandwiches. And the reason is because their war propaganda machine is one of the most disingenuous I've ever seen, to be honest. And ham sandwiches is actually very effectively conducting this war of liberation against the Israelis. World opinion of Israel is going way down the tubes, you know, and they're kind of using very, very similar tactics as the Vietnamese did in their war of national liberation, to be honest. And let's remember, that's why we're seeing, and I really think that's a purposeful move on behalf of ham sandwiches. I think they deliberately took the example from the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army and used that, because they've got a tunnel system just like the Vietnamese. They're playing a guerrilla war game and a propaganda game as well, right? Their goal is to turn public opinion against Israel to the point that it makes it so that ham sandwiches wins the war, right? And that's why we're seeing the same sort of student protests in the United States that we saw during the Vietnam War as well. It's the same kind of phenomenon is taking place here. And I think this strategy is a good one, to be honest. Although we have to understand that I think Israel as a state is much more impervious to the strategy than the South Vietnamese government and the United States were at the time. But it doesn't mean that they're going to fail, because at this point, I would say I would say the entire West, even the entire imperialist West, aside from the United States, is embarrassed about what's going on. But they're afraid to criticize Israel, and they're afraid to recognize Palestinian independence. You know, except for some of these states that have long been quite pro-Palestine, even though they're capitalist. You know, recently there was Spain, Ireland, and Norway. They recently declared that they were going to recognize Palestinian statehood soon. That was that was pretty big news that took place a couple days ago, and but these are all countries that have long been pretty vocally in support of Palestinian statehood for the two-state solution and everything. But there are other countries like France, right? France has been recently was grilled about the fact that they don't recognize Palestinian statehood, and the French representative to the United Nations just said, "Well, now's not really the right time for that." They obviously they don't want to step on the United States' toes because you're going to end up like the International Criminal Court getting sanctioned if you say anything bad about Israel. You're in danger of that. But all of these Western countries that are just colonies, the patron states of the United States, that have not recognized Palestine yet, even they are like completely ashamed of the position that they're forced to take. And the fact that, I mean, of course, right, going back to the International Criminal Court thing, of course they said also we should arrest the ham sandwiches leaders, but I don't agree with that. But the issue that the United States took with the International Criminal Court was that they saw it as an equivalency between Israel and ham sandwiches. And that's why the U.S. had suggested sanctioning the International Criminal Court. Meanwhile, there's no equivalency. Israel is way worse than ham sandwiches. It's like it's absolutely unbelievable. So this is why and this is why Marxists need to support factions in wars like this. This is why do you want to end the war in Palestine, Israel? You want to end that whole conflict? Well, you have to end the conflict of national oppression in that country. Otherwise, the people who are repressed are constantly going to fight for their freedom. The land has to be given back to those people, and the occupiers need to be kicked out. That's the only thing that's gonna rectify the contradiction. Otherwise, the war will continue. And so only by supporting the side that's fighting for national liberation from national oppression can we actually, as Marxists, bring the world closer to a world without war. So, that means that we need to support organizations that are struggling for national liberation 100%. And that's why there's even a Marxist there's a Marxist division of the Palestinian resistance forces as well. There's communists fighting alongside ham sandwiches, Islamic Jihad and all those groups, because it's also these are groups that are supported. Again, another example of a national liberation struggle being supported by the entire socialist world. North Korea doesn't like Israel, Cuba doesn't like Israel, China doesn't like Israel. The entire socialist world supports Palestine. And even the imperialist world is embarrassed about what's going on. Except the United States is the only one that's allowing Israel to continue its existence because the U.S. is threatening to militarily intervene if anyone like Hezbollah or Iran gets involved. Because if they did, Israel would be toast. But anyway, so that's basically what I wanted to talk about in terms of this question of what it means to be anti-war, right? And I thought about it because when the Russian military operation began, the main slogan of these anti-Russian military operation protesters was "Нет войне," no to war. They were against war. But they didn't understand that their position of being against the Russian military operation, if they got what they wanted, they would be perpetuating war. The war would have continued in a deepened and more contradictory state if Ukraine was able to occupy Donbass and the Russian-speaking parts of the country and repress them. That would have caused the possibility for a deeper, more protracted war in the future with Russia, because Russia would not put up with that. And so these people who were saying no to war at the beginning of the Russian military operation were actually perpetuators of war. And the people who support the Russian military operation are the opposite. If the Russian military operation is successful, which I think no doubt it will be. There's no chance I think that that things are going to go Ukraine's way. Obviously, it's just a matter of time. We don't know how long it's going to take, but I think the Russian military operation will be successful. Russia will be in a stronger, more independent economic, political, and military position than it was before the military operation was launched. And therefore, the West is going to have to think not twice, but 3 or 4 times. Next time it's going to try something like funding a color revolution on the border of Russia once again. Because after this is all done, Russia's going to be in a way stronger position to do something about it. Its military now has valuable battlefield experience. The military-industrial complex in Russia has been suited for war. It's producing 3 times as many munitions as the entire West is supplying Ukraine with. So it's going to be completely prepared for this stuff. And also, Russia's the most sanctioned country in the world. The most sanctioned country in the world. I never thought that I would be living in the most sanctioned country in the world. Before the military operation, I thought, okay, that's like North Korea, Iran, places that are, having a tough time. They have very closed economies because of how sanctioned they are. But I'm living in the most sanctioned country in the world now, and it's like there's like almost very little effect on the economy here, because since 2014, Putin's policies have allowed the economy to become much more independent from the dollar and from Western corporations. And now with what's happened after the military operation, with all these new sanctions and corporations pulling out of Russia, the Russian economy has become more independent than it was before. And this is something we talked about in previous live streams. I even made a little reaction video to a Western economist talking about this, that Russia's going to be stronger economically in the future because of these sanctions that were leveled against the country. So now, when this is all over, Russia's going to be better militarily equipped to deal with any sort of future color revolution threats. It's going to be more economically suited to be more resilient to sanctions, and there's no doubt going to be a consolidation in the multipolar world. So Russia's going to be politically in a better position to deal with this stuff as well. It's going to have closer friends than it did before. It's going to have a more independent and stronger economy and a much stronger military. And this is all the doing of the West, to be honest. If Western imperialism just minded its own business, it wouldn't have this problem right now. But anyway, thanks, Kinky, for the donation of $5. What does it mean when a person abhors Israel's genocide but applauds U.S. arming Nazis in Ukraine? I like the way you put that. How sick is that? It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't understand how people, these crazy like NAFO people on Twitter, for example, have the Palestinian flag next to the Ukrainian flag, right? It's like completely contradictory things. I mean, it's if you have, right, a proper anti-imperialist Marxist-Leninist perspective, it's as clear as day. Ukraine supported by Western imperialism, Russia not supported by Western imperialism, Israel supported by Western imperialism, Palestine not supported by Western imperialism. It's very clear who is on the progressive side of things and who's not. So for someone to call themselves a leftist and have a picture of Palestine and Ukraine next to each other, they're out of their minds. They're really out of their minds. And how do you argue with people like that? I don't really know. I don't think there's any arguing with them. Any sort of debate that you would do with them, it would just turn into a shouting match or talking over each other. I don't think there's a way to talk to them. So, unfortunately, the fighting's being done in the battlefield right now in the Russian military operation, and that's going to decide things. Because, I mean, and again, that's not how we wanted it to be. That's not how Russia wanted it to be, right? Russia has long said it's ready for negotiations. Ukraine, because it was told to by the West, has rejected negotiations. So that's just how it is. Because of their own stupid policies, this is all likely going to be decided on the battlefield. And unfortunately, that's the way things are. And NAFO dogs are really cringe, and I think there's a serious reason why they all hide behind these stupid cartoons of Doge NAFO dogs. Because have you ever seen any of these people, like the way they actually look? Because I've seen a couple of them on like videos where they're like talking about NAFO, or they did an interview with some of these NAFO people. They're like fat, ugly, neckbeard idiots, like total morons. And they're like the most disgusting looking people that you have ever seen, like people who never leave their basement. And it's really hilarious when these are the people that these are the people who are on Twitter calling us orcs, right? Calling me an orc. Go on the internet and try to find what some of these NAFO people look like, and then compare them to me, and tell me, write in the comments section if you think that I'm the orc or if they're the orc, because it's absolutely horrific. I don't even want to, like, I look at them, I'm like, ugh, I actually cringe. It's horrible. But anyway, comrades, thanks, Chris Casseroles. I appreciate the donation. It's always a pleasure having you on the live stream. But yeah, comrades, this is basically all I wanted to go through. I think I made my point about the fact that Marxists really stand by this sort of, ancient Roman quote, I guess you could say, that if you want to live in peace, you got to prepare for war. At least in the capitalist period, right? Because we support national liberation struggles. We support wars for in the defense of the very existence of a people. That's a justified war, and those people deserve to fight tooth and nail for their existence and for the liberation of their nation, no doubt. And we oppose imperialist wars. We oppose wars of aggression, wars of annihilation, which are the wars that result from the class contradictions of class society. And in our historical epoch, that's the contradictions of capitalist society. So anyway, comrades, that's all I wanted to talk about. I appreciate you all coming on for the live stream. If you haven't already, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Also, you can now donate directly on our website. Okay, we've been doing some reworking of the revolutionreport.org website. We have a donate here page on the website where you can donate directly to the Revolution Report. You don't have to go through Patreon anymore and pay their absurd fees. For right now, you can only do one-time donations, but we're going to set it up soon so that you can become a regular subscriber, just like on Patreon. But the money's going to go straight to us instead of going to Patreon. There's also going to be options for cryptocurrency donations as well soon. So keep an eye out on our website. That's going to be updated within the week or next week, depending on when we're able to get that stuff done. And yeah, comrades, the donations go a long way. We really appreciate the support that you've given to the channel. And if you're just a viewer, that's fine too. We really appreciate that you like our content, and we're happy to bring it to you as well. So without further ado, comrades, thanks for watching, and we hope to see you in the next live stream next week. And workers of the world, unite.